Israel colonization into Mesopotamia, the establishment of pipeline routes, of water pipelines, which would then in other words, the water resources of Mesopotamia, the Euphrates, would be used by Israel, and so on. All these things have been articulated to the extent that we can't really look at the Iraqi situation without an understanding of what's going on in Palestine. There are several war theaters within the Middle East, and the war in Palestine is part of that broader process. With regard to war pretext incidents, Sharon's defense advisor, General Dagan, put together a plan. It's called the Dagan Plan, which was actually formulated prior to Sharon's election, which is precisely to create civilian deaths and to use these civilian deaths on both sides, but civilian deaths on the Israeli side, which would then create the useful wave of indignation, which would be used for further militarization, occupation and colonization of the Palestinian territories. This Dagan plan then became what was called Operation Justified Vengeance. That's its translation from the Hebrew. It was a plan of the Israeli Defense Force devised by Dagan, and it has a scenario. It's an intelligence operation. Has a scenario of civilian deaths. They actually planned how many people would die over a particular period, and what this would do in terms of justifying particular actions against the Palestinian people, and of course ultimately against the Palestinian Authority. And we see where this has led us, where Israel now states that as an official policy that they want to assassinate Arafat, and the United States has put its veto to a resolution in the Security Council which condemns Israel in its planned assassination of Arafat. So in effect, the United States has supported this policy. If you identify that the United States military occupation, let's say, of Iraq or Afghanistan is the source of people's suffering, not to mention all the economic policies which are imposed on 160 countries around the world under the IMF auspices, that one should ultimately oppose this type of system, which is war and globalization. Okay? It's neoliberalism, and it's militarization, it's criminalization of the state, it's the derogation of fundamental human rights, and then you build your society. You don't resist against this system by proposing some abstract paradigm. Okay, you build it through a movement which ultimately deconstructs and rebuilds. Counter-discourse is a very important instrument in supporting regimes, in supporting governments, in supporting war agendas, because it's a way in which you manufacture dissent, which
which ultimately provides legitimacy to the established order. The manufacturing of dissent means that people express their dissent and their resentment, whether it's against the war or whether it's against globalization, in a particular stylized way. And the boundaries of dissent are already established. So in other words, again, they will say, I'm against the war, but I think Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. And that's a form of dissent which ultimately reinforces the system rather than weakens it. And in other words, there's a big strand of opposition within America, which ultimately, by making this kind of statement and analyzing in a particular way these occurrences, are in fact supporting the New World Order agenda. Not necessarily Bush, but they're saying, okay, well, we don't like Bush, but then the Democrats will come in. In other words, they want the system to remain afloat, and they don't realize that ultimately there's nothing which is going to there's nothing in their positions and in their activism which is going to reverse the tide of the military-industrial complex, of the new drive towards nuclear weapons.
This system is increasingly characterized by very centralized corporate control. Eventually the agenda, and that's the corporate agenda, is to privatize all forms of state-supported social activities. Massive redirection of resources from civilian activities into the production of weapons and all the concurrent activities which support the war agenda. There are lower levels of demand within the system because there are lower levels of employment, and the important thing there is that this military-industrial complex doesn't create jobs. It's not comparable in any way to the 1930s or 40s, where the war economy was the basis for getting out of the Great Depression. Okay? This war economy does not create jobs other than the young people who are recruited to go and fight in the Middle East. But it does not, it's highly capital intensive. It's not a big assembly line where thousands or tens of thousands of people are being hired and where jobs are created. So that we cannot expect that the war economy will generate new jobs, which will then allow other sectors of the economy to progress. It's quite the opposite. The prisons are being used to assemble goods, to produce commodities, and of course, it's in a sense it's an appendage of the cheap labor economy. But you see, there's another aspect when you get into the international dimensions of this economic crisis, is that what is sustaining the U.S. Consumer goods industries today is the fact that a large percentage of what we actually consume on a day-to-day basis is produced in China, Bangladesh, Mexico, Indonesia. In other words, in countries where the wages are 30, 40, 50 times lower than in the United States.
People who are pulling the strings in the background, the big corporations, the big Wall Street banks, the military-industrial complex, they want to ensure the continuity of the system. And the way to do that is to pull the plug on a president who is discredited in the eyes of public opinion, and then ensure the transition to a new group of people, a new set of political puppets, who will then perform, perhaps with a slightly different agenda, but ultimately supported by the same economic corporate interests that operate behind the scenes. I think that's really what is important to understand, is that the Bush administration and even members of Bush entourage, senior Bush officials, are instruments. They're not ultimately the architects of this war agenda. During the Clinton administration, all these war plans were already on the agenda. The national security doctrine of the Clinton administration clearly points out